The wind was a thief. It stole the moisture from the soil, the paint from the clapboard, the hope from a woman's heart, leaving behind only a fine, gritty dust that coated everything in a monochrome of despair. Eliza stood on the porch of the sod house her husband had built, his hands raw and his spirit bright, before the earth had turned on them and finally claimed him. Now the wind sang a hollow dirge through the warped boards, a constant reminder of all she had lost. The sky was not blue but a bruised, ochre ceiling that pressed down, suffocating the light. Her world had shrunk to this barren square of land, a few scrawny chickens, and the ever-present ache of solitude. Loneliness was a physical weight, a second shadow that clung to her even in the dim light of her lantern. She had come to believe this was all that was left. The wind, the dust, and the waiting for an end that refused to arrive. That afternoon, driven by a gnawing worry over the last of her water, she'd followed the dry creek bed further than she usually dared. The rattling of a loose fence post had drawn her eye, a task for a tomorrow that felt as hypothetical as rain. And then she saw him. He was a heap of dark clothing and stillness against the pale, cracked earth, almost another casualty of the drought. Her first instinct, born of fear and isolation, was to retreat. A dead man was trouble. A living one could be worse. But as she drew closer, a shallow, rattling breath reached her, a sound as fragile as a dying bird's. He was lying face down, a dark fletching protruding from the thick fabric of his coat, grotesquely angled just below his shoulder blade. An arrow. It was a savage, primitive wound in a world of gunpowder and steel. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced the dull armor of her grief. She was alone, miles from any semblance of law or neighbor. To help him was to invite his trouble into her fragile shelter. To leave him was to become as merciless as the land itself. She knelt, her worn dress absorbing the dust. His face was turned away, half buried in the dirt. A dark, broad-brimmed hat lay nearby. With trembling fingers, she brushed the hair from his cheek. He was unconscious, his skin clammy and pale beneath a layer of grime and stubble. A tremor of life, a deep, shuddering groan, passed through him. In that sound, she heard not a threat, but a desperate plea that echoed her own. She could not leave him to the vultures and the sun. The decision settled not in her mind, but in her bones. It was a foolish, reckless act, and yet, it was the first thing she had chosen to do in months that felt like living. Gritting her teeth, she looped her arms beneath his, her slight frame straining against his dead weight. The world spun into a haze of effort and dust. She dragged him, inch by agonizing inch, back toward the small, dark square of her home. His boots carving two long, desperate furrows in the land that had already taken everything else. The air inside the sod house was thick and cool, a respite from the relentless wind. It smelled of earth, old smoke, and the faint, bitter scent of dried herbs. Laying the man on her husband's narrow cot, she worked with a grim, focused desperation she hadn't known she possessed. His breathing was a ragged, shallow rhythm that seemed to count down his final seconds. With a pair of shears, she cut away the heavy wool coat and the blood-stiffened shirt beneath it. The wound was ugly, the flesh around the arrowhead swollen and angry. Tucked into an inner pocket of his coat, a glint of metal caught the weak light. It was a tarnished silver star, heavy and simple. U.S. Marshal. The discovery sent a new wave of fear through her. Lawman drew the lawless. She had not brought home a mere stranger. She had brought home a target. For a long moment, she held the badge, its weight a heavy premonition in her palm. Then she set it aside on the small, rough-hewn table. His identity did not change the fact of his dying. She boiled water, her movements practiced and sure. She needed to get the arrow out. The memory of her father lancing a boil on a horse, swift and brutal, came to her. There was no room for hesitation. Taking the sharpest knife she owned and a bottle of whiskey saved for a winter that might never come, she approached the cot. He stirred as she touched him, his eyes fluttering open. They were a startlingly clear gray, clouded with pain and confusion. He tried to speak, but only a dry rasp emerged. "Hold still," she whispered, her voice rough from disuse. It was less a comfort and more a command. He seemed to understand. His jaw clenched, a muscle twitching in his cheek, but he did not fight her. She poured whiskey over the wound, and he arched against the cot with a suppressed hiss, his hands clenching into fists. With the knife, she carefully sliced the flesh wider around the shaft, her stomach churning at the sight and sound. Then, bracing one hand on his back, she gripped the splintered wood and pulled. It was a single, clean motion, followed by a guttural cry torn from his throat before he fell back into unconsciousness. Blood welled, dark and sluggish. She worked quickly, cleaning the wound as best she could, packing it with a poultice of yarrow and binding it tightly with strips of clean linen. For the next day and night, he drifted in a fevered haze. Eliza sat by the cot, bathing his face, forcing sips of water between his cracked lips. In his delirium, he spoke fragments of words, a name, a place, a curse. She listened, piecing together nothing. He was a ghost, a collection of pained murmurs and labored breaths. When the fever finally broke, he woke with a quiet clarity that was more unnerving than his delirium. He watched her, his gray eyes missing nothing as she moved about the small room, tending the fire, mending a tear in her dress. He did not speak. Neither did she. The silence between them was not empty, but filled with a dense, unspoken awareness. She offered him a bowl of thin broth, and he took it, his hand surprisingly steady. He ate slowly, deliberately, his gaze never leaving her. It was not a look of suspicion, but of quiet, intense assessment. She felt herself being measured, weighed. When he was done, he pushed the bowl back toward her. "Thank you," he said. The words were low and gravelly, but clear. It was the first time he had spoken to her, and the sound of his voice seemed to alter the very air in the room, making it smaller, more intimate. She simply nodded, taking the bowl, her back to him as she felt a strange warmth creep up her neck. A connection had been forged in that shared silence, built not on words, but on the primal acts of care and survival. He was a danger, she knew, but as he watched her, she felt not fear, but the faintest, unfamiliar flicker of being seen. The dawn arrived not with light, but with a thickening of the gray air. A change in the wind's tone, a deeper, more menacing howl, woke her from a light, troubled sleep on her pallet by the hearth. The marshal, whose name she still did not know, was already awake. He was sitting up on the cot, his posture rigid with tension, his gaze fixed on the single shuttered window. He had found his gun belt where she had placed it, and though he had not buckled it on, his hand rested near the worn leather holster. "Company," he rasped, the word a stark pronouncement of doom. Her heart seized. She crept to the window, peering through a crack in the wood. 3 riders sat on their horses, dark silhouettes against the churning dust. They were not neighbors. They were specters of violence, their stillness radiating a patient menace that froze the blood in her veins. One of them, a tall man with a long coat that whipped in the wind, dismounted and began a slow, deliberate walk toward her door. "Mom." The voice that cut through the wind was deceptively pleasant, laced with a cold, predatory confidence. "Cole Ledbetter. We're looking for a man. Answers to the name Blackwood. We tracked him this way. Seen him?" Eliza's hand flew to her throat. She looked back at the marshal. His face was a mask of stone, but his eyes burned with a fever that had nothing to do with his wound. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible shake of his head. He was Blackwood to them. The name hung in the air, thick with the implication of a bounty. "Ain't seen anyone," she called back, her voice tighter and higher than she intended. "Just me here," the man. Cole laughed. It was not a pleasant sound. "Now, I don't believe that's true. My associate, he's a fair tracker, says your friend left a trail a blind man could follow. Now, this Blackwood, he's worth a fair piece of change. $500. We'd be willing to share a bit of that. For your trouble, the offer was a greasy temptation, a path back to a life with more than dust and broth. For a fleeting, shameful second, she considered it. $500 could take her away from this grave her husband had dug. Then she looked at the man on the cot. He was watching her, his expression unreadable, leaving the choice entirely to her. He had trusted her. He was weak, wounded, and utterly at her mercy. Handing him over would not be a transaction. It would be a betrayal that would hollow her out more completely than any drought. Strength, cold and clear, flooded her. It was the strength of a cornered animal, of a woman with nothing left to lose and, suddenly, one thing to protect. "I told you," she said, her voice now low and steady, carrying over the wind. "There's no one here. You best be on your way." There was a long silence from outside. Then Cole's voice, stripped of all pretense. "That was your last chance, ma'am." The quiet click of a rifle hammer being cocked was unmistakable. The marshal moved, swinging his legs off the cot with a sharp intake of breath. He was pale, sweating, but his hands were steady as he drew the Colt from its holster. He met her eyes across the room. "The floorboards," he breathed. "To your right." Loose Eliza dropped to her knees, her fingers fumbling at the rough plank he'd indicated. Beneath it lay her husband's old shotgun, wrapped in oilcloth. Her hands closed around the cold steel and smooth wood. The weight was solid, real. As she rose, the first splintering crash came as the butt of a rifle slammed against the door. She looked at the marshal. He gave her a single, grim nod. In that moment they were not a lawman and a widow. They were partners, bound by the closing circle of wolves. The door shuddered again, the wood groaning, and Eliza lifted the shotgun, its twin barrels aimed at the heart of the storm about to break upon them. The door splintered inward with a violent crack, bursting open to admit a maelstrom of dust and a silhouette framed against the gray morning. Cole Ledbetter stepped inside, his rifle leveled, a cruel smirk on his face that faltered as he took in the scene. He saw not a frightened woman and a dying man, but a tableau of defiance. Eliza stood beside the hearth, the double-barreled shotgun held steady, its dark eyes promising annihilation. Across the room, the marshal was braced against the wall, his Colt revolver held in a two-handed grip, his face pale but his aim unwavering. The two other bounty hunters crowded in behind their leader, their expressions of easy confidence curdling into surprise. The small sod house became a tinderbox of tension, every breath a spark. "Well now," Cole said, his voice a low growl. "Look at the little prairie hen, all puffed up." He took another step. It was his last. The world exploded in a deafening roar and a cloud of acrid smoke. The shotgun kicked back against Eliza's shoulder with bruising force, the blast tearing through the cramped space. Cole was thrown backward as if by an invisible fist, his chest a ruin, his surprise forever etched on his face. The room erupted into chaos. One of the remaining men fired wildly, the bullet thudding into the earthen wall behind the marshal's head. The marshal returned fire, a single, deliberate shot. The man cried out, clutching his leg as he stumbled back into his partner. Eliza, deafened and trembling, worked on pure, cold instinct. She broke open the shotgun, her fingers fumbling with the fresh shells she'd laid on the mantelpiece. The remaining bounty hunter, his face a mask of panic, raised his pistol toward her. But he was too slow. A second shot cracked from the marshal's Colt, and the man crumpled, his unfired gun clattering to the floorboards. Silence descended, thick and absolute, broken only by the ragged gasps of the wounded man by the door and the ceaseless moan of the wind outside. The smell of gunpowder and blood filled the air. Eliza stood frozen, the heavy shotgun still in her hands, her knuckles white. She had killed a man. The reality of it was a cold, hard stone in her gut. She looked down at Cole's still form, then at the wounded, whimpering man near the threshold. The marshal spoke, his voice strained. "Bolt the door," his command cut through her shock. She moved, her legs unsteady, and shoved the broken door back into its frame, dropping the heavy bar into place. It was a flimsy defense, but it shut out the accusing gray light. She turned to face the marshal. He had slid down the wall, his face ashen, a fresh stain of red spreading across the bandage on his back. He had spent the last of his strength. She went to him, setting the shotgun aside. She knelt and helped him back to the cot, his weight heavy against her. The ordeal was over, but its residue lingered, a grim stain on the quiet sanctuary of her home. She tended to his reopened wound, her hands no longer trembling but moving with a deliberate, somber efficiency. After, she sat in the chair beside him, the silence stretching between them once more. The bodies of the dead were a terrible, unavoidable fact just a few feet away. "My name is Silas," he said finally, his voice barely a whisper. She looked at him, his gray eyes, cleared of pain and filled with an exhausted gratitude, met hers. "They weren't bounty hunters," he continued, his breathing shallow. "Not real ones. They were wanted for robbery and murder near the Cimarron. Blackwood was one of their own they'd killed. They were using his name, his bounty, as cover. I was tracking them when they ambushed me." The revelation settled over her. She had not protected a criminal. She had defended a lawman in the execution of his duty. And in doing so, she had become something other than a victim of her circumstances. The wind outside seemed to gentler, its keening softening to a sigh. She had faced the violence of men and had not been broken. She looked at her hands, raw and capable. They had tended wounds, fired a gun, and held fast. They were no longer the hands of a grieving, helpless woman. They were her own. "Eliza," she said, her own name feeling new on her tongue. He nodded slowly, a faint, weary smile touching his lips. Eliza, the dust would return. The hardships were not over. But as the day bled into a quiet, shadowed afternoon, she knew she would not face them alone. The world was still a harsh and unforgiving place, but for the first time in a long time, the silence in her home was not the sound of loneliness, but the sound of survival. It was the sound of a shared breath in a quiet room, a silent promise to see the sun rise together.